In my small workshop, I had a workbench which really wasn't working out too well for me. It took up a lot of space and I wanted to use some of that space for storing sheets of plywood and melamine. Also, I've noticed that other than using the vise, I never really tend to use it as a work surface. I always seem to end up working on the floor and the workbench just becomes a bit of a dumping ground for tools. Another issue I had with it was that the bottom shelf was open, so it gets covered in sawdust and needs cleaning regularly. I recently fitted a new kitchen in my house, and as I never really like to throw things away, I gave some of the old kitchen cabinets away and held on to one of them. I had an idea to use it as a base for the new workbench. It was 800mm wide by 720mm high, and it has 2 cupboard doors at the bottom and 2 drawers at the top. I wanted the new workbench to be 980mm high so that it could double up as an outfeed table for my table saw. That meant that I would have enough space available underneath the worktop to place tools while I was working. So I started to clear the area and disassemble the old workbench. And I removed the vise too. I had some old salvaged 3x2s that I could use to make the legs, and I cut these to length on the miter saw. The 3x2s were rough sawn, so I used the jointer to plane each surface of the legs just to clean them up and make them smooth. Before planing, I was careful to check for any nails or staples in the wood which would cause damage to the jointer blades. Then I placed the carcass of the cabinet onto 2 pieces of wood, using them as shims to lift it off the floor so that the legs would support the weight of the bench rather than the carcass. I clamped the legs to the side of the carcass and screwed through the carcass into the legs. I used drywall screws for this and didn't bother drilling pilot holes. For the back legs, I positioned them centred to the rear panel of the carcass and then screwed through from both the back side and from inside the cabinet. With all the legs fitted, I could then fit the shelf again. The shelf just sits on some small metal pins that slot into holes, and there are also these white clips that also fit into the holes to hold the shelf into position from the top down. Then I could fit the drawers back into the runners and the cabinet doors. I decided I'd make use of the worktop from the original workbench rather than making a new one. I also used part of the old workbench's frame as a straight edge to mark up the size I wanted. And I used it again as a fence for the circular saw to cut the worktop to the right size, just by clamping it to the board, offset 3cm from the lines I'd drawn, as 3cm is the distance between the fence of the circular saw and the blade. I'm going to keep hold of this piece of the frame as it'll be useful to use as a straight edge for future projects, so I'll find a home for it in the workshop somewhere. To make the workbench more sturdy, I wanted to add some braces. I had an old piece of pine bed frame that I'd found, so I cut this to the length of the workbench on the miter saw and added this to the back of the frame using wood glue and screws. I'd sanded off the varnish on each end just before adding the glue so it would bond properly. I used a clamp to hold one end while I screwed in the other end. I also had some old pieces of pine salvaged from an old futon bed frame. And these were cut to size and glued and screwed to the sides at the top. I cut a small piece of pine to use as a cleat and glued and screwed this to the inside of the side braces. This would later be used to attach the worktop to the rest of the frame. I added another brace for the sides at the bottom. This was glued and screwed to the outside of the legs, and I just used a block of wood underneath while fitting it as a spacer. Then it was time to add the worktop. I centered it on top of the frame just by feel, by running my fingers around each edge. and then I screwed through the cleats on the frame into the bottom of the worktop, making sure to use screws that weren't so long that they could pierce through the top of the worktop. Luckily I had just enough space for my drill here, but I did have to screw them in at a bit of an angle, so it was a little awkward. Later I fitted the vise and did a Matthias Wandel style jump test to make sure the new workbench was good and strong. I later added some drawer dividers. These are just made out of 5mm plywood cut to the shape of the drawer, with a piece of angle moulding glued and nailed to each side so that they stand upright. This was a really quick build. It only took about 3 hours to put the workbench together, and it should be a useful addition to the workshop. And best of all, it didn't cost any money at all.